Good afternoon. Getting a little wild in here. Button that. All right. So, getting exciting. Where do we leave off? Yes. The end of chapter 13. We have the matter of the temple built with King Solomon. And here we enter into 14, where we see the history continuing in the spiritual significance with the kings of Israel, also seen here as the kings of Babylon, and also the kings that went to war with Chedorlaomer. So starting with chapter 14, we have these first three verses here, especially these first two verses, where you list 4 kings going to war with 5 kings. Okay. Oh, Lord. The first 4 kings, their names are very significant. First off, it starts with the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. Now, Shinar means 2 rivers, and it's in between one river, Euphrates, the other river, the Tigris. We'll see in Genesis 2, Euphrates is the name of the one name of the 3 rivers, also indicating the triune God as a source. But the Tigris is the Hiddekel River. After the Babylonians took it over, they named it Tigris. The difference between the 2 names between the Hiddekel and Tigris is the Tigris is flowing to kill. Okay? Like a hunter. The 2 rivers are, in a sense, 2 different speakings. The name Amraphel means sayer of darkness. So there's 2 speakings, actually, which what started the entire rebellion of the kings with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. But before that, honestly, it was the matter of a worship center set up by Dan. Too inconvenient to go to Jerusalem to worship, so they set up a worship center there in the northern part of Israel. Dan kind of looks like the Denmark and all the tribes. And let's see. We got the King of Shinar. What started it eventually led to 2 different speakings. Rehoboam and Jeroboam separated, and it became the division of Israel, the collapse of everything. We will see here. The next one is Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of Goam. Now, these kings and their names are actually the names of. Let's just go through it here. We have Arioch, king of Elazar. Arioch means lion-like. What we have to realize is when God deals with the chastising of his people, which Elazar means God's chastiser, he's chastising them in the sense of to recover them back to himself. And the kings and their history of them in 2 Kings, especially, we see there's dealings for ultimately the Lord has to bring in the Assyrians and the Babylonians to take them captive, and using the nations as a chastising for his people. The other one is Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. And Chedorlaomer means bound sheaves. Elam means, it's got a from root mean conceal. Perhaps that could be anything from God concealing his intention with the nations. Concealed within that is God's chastisement. It has another name of highland, or like a high peak. Sort of maybe a, when it comes to war, having the high end is more advantage. And we will see that there's a reason why there's advantage there, because God has it set up to chastise his people. Because they're all separated. Rehoboam stayed there with the kingdom of Judah, and we see the kings of the kingdom of Judah. And then Jeroboam, of course, with the nation of Israel, and the whole place is split. Well, there's judgment come for both. The Assyrians come first to the nation of Israel, and the Babylonians come second to, man, Lord, Kingdom of Judah. Okay. All right, so the next one is Kali Omar, bound sheaves, King of Elam. And the bound sheaves are the, signified by the people of Israel, especially Joseph's brothers in his dream, were sheaves. And bound sheaves means take captive. Bound them up. Title: King of the Nations. And you realize, again, this matter of the use of the nations as even in the sense of king, as in the sense of representing God as far as chastisement is concerned. They made war with Bera, the king of Sodom. Bera, son of evil. Sodom is scorched, representing the fire aspect of God's judgment. Now, Gomorrah is submersion, which represents the water aspect of God's judgment. Okay? But God promised not to judge the world with flood after the rainbow, so now it's with fire. But in a sense, the flood came because of the wickedness, which is actually what Bersha, king of Gomorrah, means. The wickedness, not necessarily the nature. Although man became flesh, the wickedness filled the earth and he had it. You're hot. Wow. Lord have mighty. Lord have mighty. He is mighty. Lord have mercy. With me? All right. Bera, the king of Sodom. Bersha, the king of Gomorrah. Shinab, the king of Admah. Looking up this name here, Shinab, actually, in a sense, starts with this matter of, I don't like to use it, but it's a counterfeit satanic trinity with the Father, Son, and Spirit, as you see in these next three names here. Shinab means like father's tooth or splendor of father, or it's the father wanting recognition, almost also a father of mutation. If you're the father, you don't need the splendor. Your dad. Here, though, with Satan entering into man, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, entering man became its own father. In a sense, Satan, brood of vipers, what are you doing here? Who prompts you to flee from that coming wrath? Show them fruits worthy of your repentance, and don't tell me that you got Abraham as your father. I'll tell you God's able to raise up out of these stones children of Abraham. So, and since Satan has sin in man, has brooded some vipers, son of evil, so there's a need for fire. But then you have the next one. The king of Admah. Adam, which is red dirt, which we all are, red-skinned, right? Because of blood flowing through us. But he is the king of Admah. You look at that name, it's kind of like a counterfeit of the Father, you know. Now look when you go here to Shimber, king of Zeboim. His is a matter of a lofty flight or a name of force. It's almost like a forced name. Now remember, Shimber, the word Shem is in it, referring to the father of this whole thing. These are the generations of Shem, starting in Genesis 11, with the name, but it's a name of force. You know, God never wants to force his name. You know, if he's that great, he never has to force anybody to convince that he's great. Hey, everybody, I'm God. You know, God doesn't have to say that. Okay. So you see a matter of the Son in the sense of a counterfeit. You know, who has the name of the Godhead? It's Jesus. It's the Son. But here we see a counterfeit also with this word Zeboim. He was the king of Zeboim, which is actually not necessarily a gazelle. It is a gazelle, but more of a hyena, a wild gazelle, nothing under restriction, you know. Well, Christ is the reality of the gazelle, as we see in Song of Songs, and as we see as the one who's leaping and skipping on an ascension, on the mountains. So again, we see another counterfeit, the satanic. It's kind of satanic trinity, kind of like instead of the sun, it's the lofty flight. It's a name of force. And then Bela is just the king of Bela, which means devour, which is a counterfeit of the spirit. Instead of the spirit giving life, 1 Corinthians 15:45 and 2 Corinthians 3:6, we have the matter of a king that's out to devour. The enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. He came to give life. So we see this option here. Then it says that is to Zor. Okay. And that's Zor, insignificant, which also is the place of the remnant. So within Satan's attack on God's people, ultimately to devour them completely, they're still a remnant. And this isn't even the story of 2 Kings. Within all the horrible stories that we have and the fall of God's people and the ruin and the corruption of the kings, we have a preservation. And ultimately see why God's hand was allowed for the Assyrians to come in, for the Babylonians to come in and take their people to deal with these kings. Not just merely the people, but the angels, the fallen angels behind them. We'll see this actually in the pits of Tartarus. Gloomy pits coming up here is a sign of the pits of Tartarus. 2 Peter 2:5. We'll get there. Okay, so these first two verses have set a stage. One is the first group of kings showing, in a sense, a revelation of how God deals with his people using the nations. Nations that are behind it is God's hand. Then the ones, verse 2, they made war with the kings, and since the spiritual condition of the people, and what was needed was judgment. They were son of evil, son of wickedness or impiety. They were, father of splendor, counterfeit of the satanic, of the triune God as a counterfeit. With the father, the splendor of father, a name, a force, opinion, sort of like heroism. It's like I'm a hero, renown of the hero. If you're a hero, you need to be known. There's a lot more where this comes from, but ultimately you see in these names what's been going on behind the physical scenes of 2 Kings, especially 2 Kings, and what's led to their captivity. There was two different sources, two different speakings. There was a worship center set up in Dan. And Satan, because he was in man and in God's people, corrupted it to the point of God had to use the nations to deal with them. Kedaleomar, ultimately, and Nebuchadnezzar, Mount Sheaves, keep them captive. All right. Now, verse 3. You with me? Kind of setting the stage up for the two verses. Hopefully, put it down in the comments. All right? If somebody ever watches these things. I mean, I think only 6 people watched even one of my videos, and then it was my mom twice. I jumped in there, and then I think my dad glanced at it, so somewhere around there. So anyway, hey, somebody better watch it. Okay. Wait, you with me? We have a hippopotamus in this house? All right. Verse 3. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. Now, Siddim and the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, is the lowest point on earth. It's like hell. And war is actually first mentioned here in the Bible. The first time war is mentioned. Now, the source of it is Tubal-Cain, making weapons, because man lost God as security, so he had to make weapons to replace God as his security. But ultimately, we have Nimrod as the first hunter. And here's the first war. And they're meeting in the Dead Sea, the lowest point. Remember that, because there's something lower than that. So set them in the Dead Sea signifies haze, but the tar pits you'll see is a little bit lower. It'd be the tar pits there. That'd be the lowest point on Earth. And that is the gloomy pits of Tartarus as a sign. Watch this. Verse 4. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Served Chedorlaomer. And in the 13th year they rebelled. In a sense, before the rebellion, all the nation of Israel was since kept as a bound sheaf in Israel until the rebellion. And the numbers are very significant. 13 is 1 above 12. 12 is what God wanted for eternity, past to eternity, future. It's his completion, eternal completion. And what he wanted was 12 tribes and a kingdom. But 13 is 1 on top of that. It's a work of the flesh, really is what it is. Ishmael was circumcised at 13. 13 is a flesh. It's trying to do something for God in your flesh. There was a rebellion. We had a Jeroboam-Rehoboam accident. Okay? And so now it's time for God's judgment, starting with oh, that feels good. Yeah, baby. The Assyrians. And here we go. And in the 14th year, that's big. If you look at the genealogy of Jesus Christ, there's 14 generations from David to the Babylonian captivity. Think about that. So in the 14th year, here comes Chedorlaomer, the kings who were with him, came and what? Struck the Rephaim and Asheroth. Carneum. Which is, Asheroth is a goddess, a fertility goddess, Babylonian fertility goddess. The Rephaim are the giants, and this actually is also indicated to the worship center that was set up in Dan. Now, this first striking here is for the nation of Israel. They were struck by the Assyrians, not Judah. Israel. And the Asheroth, the Rephaim in Asheroth, signifies the worship center that they set up there. No, that's a fake burp. That was a false alarm. False alarm there. And so they took out the worship center. And then Zuzim and Ham is a matter of open dwelling, nation in rebellion, burnt heat, getting burnt, getting under God's judgment. Which is what the nation of Israel really became. I mean, it's called the nation of Israel. But the nation, see, God still saw his nation because the real dwelling place of God, with real kingdom of God, was in Jerusalem. Not with the other 10 tribes that left. Feel me? Okay. Judah and Benjamin, they stayed. Okay. But they're still under God's judgment too. We will still see that. Zuzim, Ham, Emin, and Sheva. What is this? Eminem is in Sheva. Anyways, it's a fearsome one in a double city. Double city. There should only be one city. That was Jerusalem. So there's a double city now. They're going to have their own local. I don't really know what they had as a capital. To look that up. But they got 2 cities now. It's part of the judgment. Eminem. Emim. Fearsome ones. Okay, and the Horites in Mount Seir. Horites are the cave dwellers. Seir is the shaggy, ruffy, hairy, in a sense, it could be the natural man, like Esau was natural. But ultimately, the cave dwellers, the most they do is dwell in the caves, not be on the mountain for God's testimony, but dwelling in the caves. The nation of Israel, in a sense, is still part of God's people. They weren't on the real mountain. You get what I'm saying? So we can take verse 5. In verse 6. Oh, and El Paran, big one. El is God, Paran is ornament. So they had the ornament, the appearance of God. And the fact that they had the name Israel. But it was just an ornament. It's not really where God was dwelling. Got it? So, verse 5 and 6. Well, verse 4 is the rebellion. And the source of that is the fact that these kings were all meeting together for war at the lowest point of earth. And since that's the spiritual significance of Israel during the kings. And then verse 4, we have the 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, 13 years they rebelled. That is the rebellion of Israel, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, leading to the 14th year when the Assyrians came in. And by 14th year, 14th generation. Kedorlaomer, the kings with him, they struck the Rephaim, taking care of the, now we're talking about the nation of Israel, right? It's the worship center of Dan. Zuzim, Ham. Zuzim, and Ham. Sounds like a delightful dish. And the Horites of Mount Seir and Upper Rams, which by the wilderness. So ending with verse 6, and by the wilderness, meaning, wilderness is always the in-between. And that's where the nation of Israel was. They weren't necessarily the condemned, but they weren't in the promised land. They were in between, recognized as the nation of Israel, as God's people. There's some spiritual significance there now. So, verse 4 is Rehoboam, Jeroboam's the split with a source of two rivers there in verse 1, Shinar. Verse 5 and verse 6 is the Assyrians and God's use of them for their chastisement on the nation of Israel, as also seen by the names and the fact that in the wilderness. But then there's the Babylonians that come in, starting with verse 7. They turn back and came to Eshmishpat. Eshmishpat, fountain of judgment, spring of judgment. Kadesh is the sanctified, holy, separated. Well, there's a judgment now because the kings have absolutely destroyed that matter of sanctification, of holiness, separation from the nations to be God's people. So there was a fountain of judgment on that. Okay? Now, that is Kadesh, and that's also in parentheses, because it wasn't considered that actually. It was considered a matter of there's a judgment. The fountain has been judged. The source has been judged. Okay? Which is where Jerusalem is in Judah. Oh! Get up there. Just stay up. Just stay up. Now. Well, we're at 23 minutes. So we might only get to verse 12 today. I mean, in this section. This ain't my last one. All right. They struck all the country of the Amalekites. Amalekites also signify the flesh throughout the scriptures. We first see them in Exodus 17 as far as the experience of them. But here they're mentioned right here as a sense of what Judah became. This is the judgment of Judah. As a country of the flesh. That's actually how it all started. Solomon had all these wives, and he had foreign wives. The matter of the flesh was prevalent. And so it became a country of the flesh, country of the Amalekites. And also the Amorites. What? Yes. The Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. Now, the Amorites are the mountain sayers. Although, you notice it wasn't the cave dwellers like the nation of Israel because they really didn't have Mount Zion. Now, the king of Judah had Mount Zion and Jerusalem and God speaking. Did they? Well, it was almost like a counterfeit because it had the Amorites and they were like mountain sayers. They had the appearance, but in a sense, they had God speaking through the prophets, but what they were speaking forth ultimately was not God. It was the lust of the flesh, right? It was Israel. Now, Hazaron Tamar is interesting. Pruning of the palms. And when it comes to palm trees, always link it up with Hosanna. The palm, the branches that was given for the Lord's coming into Jerusalem. And palms trees also seem like deliverance. But the deliverance needed pruning. Ultimately, God did deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, through the Jordan, into the good land, and set up his house, ultimately his kingdom. What a deliverance, but that deliverance needed pruning. Another sign of God's judgment. Okay. Now, ultimately, you have, with verse 7, the Babylonian conquest, including verse 8. And onward, we have the matter of where they took Lot. That's the captivity. But between there, we have kind of a scene here of what's happened. It says in the, verse 8, the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, right? Which are the ones that are signifying the conditions of God's people, right? Went forth and set battle in array against them in the valley of Siddim. Okay, then you have against Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam, Tidal, the king of Goyim, Armphil, the king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Elzar. 4 kings against 5. You would think 5 would win, but it's the 4 that win. Also showing God's sovereignty in the matter. You know, how could 4 kings beat 5? Well, because God's here to deal with his people. And in the sense, you look at the Spanish Armada, you know, how could that ever happen? Well, it's for Catholicism not to increase into the New World and for Protestantism to take over in the sense of God's move. We can look at these little things of wars throughout where God has used the nations not only to chastise his people, but also to carry out his administration for his eternal purpose and economy. So in verse 8, you have these kings against here, 4 kings against 5. And then it says in verse 10, now the valley of Siddim, the lowest point on earth, was full of tar pits. Yes, tar pits. Also known as the gloomy pits of Tartarus, where the fallen kings, you know, what instigated Israel to become as corrupt as they did through the kings? There was a king of Sodom, if you think about it. A fallen angel that rebelled during the satanic rebellion that, in a sense, Satan gave him this kingdom and, in a sense, corrupted it. And these are, according to Peter, which we can look up right now. And Jude. I probably should pull these up beforehand, but can't win them all. Oh, 2 Peter, yeah. It says, for God did not spare, this is 2 Peter 2:4, for God did not spare the angels who sinned, but delivered them to gloomy pits, having them cast them down to Tartarus, they being kept for judgment. And then it says, and did not spare the ancient world, but guarded Noah, herald of righteousness, and 7 others, which when he brought a flood upon the world of God. And then look, and having reduced to ashes the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, condemned them to ruin, having set them as example to those who intend to live an ungodly life, and rescued righteous Lot, who had been oppressed by the licentious manner of the lawless. What's the lowest point on our Siddim? But with that is a Tartarus. And Tartarus, in Jewish Hebrew belief, and in the Bible, is lower than Hades. And that would be the tar pits of Siddim. And this is the judgment that was brought upon the king of Sodom through, one moment, through through the judgment, the king of Sodom. Okay, so now it says, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, but those who survived fled to the hill country. Well, in a sense, there was a survival, a captivity. But it says they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and went away. And this is the captivity. So captivity, in a sense, you go, ooh, that's a bad story among the Jews, but it's also, in a sense, God's sovereign hand for the preservation of his people who may have turned away, but at the same time, the Sodom needed to be judged. Now, the Sodom happens again in judgment at the end of the age. I mean, not at the end of the age, but with Titus, AD 70. That was a judgment for the religious Sodom. The other one was judgment for the Sodom of Kings in 2 Kings. Okay? And they took Lot, Abram's brother. Abram's brother's son. And whose possessions departed because he was dwelling in Sodom. So what happened was they took Lot. And that is the Babylonian captivity. And within that, there is a preservation. So God deals with his people, chastises his people, to deal not only with their heart, but even with these fallen angels. The judgment. When he puts the Tartarus. I don't know if you guys are with me, but all right, they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, and possession departed, for he was dwelling in Sodom. And we're going to stop there because we're already at 32 minutes. So what you have here, ultimately, is the captivity of Babylon. You have the 2 Kings into the captivity of Babylon. And the recovery will start in verse 13 with the word Hebrew, Abram the Hebrew. And he goes into rescue Lot, and we'll see this is a matter of the return of the captivity. But that might take another 20 to 30 minutes, especially when we get into the matter of Melchizedek. So I'm going to leave it right there. That's part 3 from the story of 2 Kings into the captivity. 1 and 2 Kings into the captivity. I got my extension. I double checked. Triple checked. All right. Well, anyway, smash that, tap that, hit that, do what you need to do for the like button. Keep smashing on it all day long. Subscribe to my pay-per-view. Or whatever YouTube channel. Get the real nitty-gritty, which is pretty much what you're looking at right here. And we will come back to it, starting with the Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther in verse 13. The recovery of God's people. We're almost there. Anyways. Better just sign off. Don't forget to leave a comment down below. See you guys on part 4. Thank you.